So, as you maybe have heard, I was supposed to be one of the co-organizers of this conference, but I think my major contribution, and I'm very proud of it, was to awake Florian out of his Spinozistic slumber in order to organize this conference, telling him that it might be very important for his academic career. And this time he listened to me. So I will summarize what I will do in 3 words. The third word is, and was suggested to me by Sibrand, who in a very polite and delicate way, in order to give some comment on my title, he said, so you will be the terminator. And indeed, it fits quite well with what I will do. The second word is, what I will do is a metaphysical thought experiment. I would prefer the term fable métaphysique. The problem is it does not end well. Third is linked to 2, namely in light of Spinozistic philosophy of Spinoza, and you will say not only in that context but in general, my contribution will be and will sound completely absurd. Ad quae hoc absurdum est. As you know, Spinoza also liked to add to that comment, ut per se notum, namely, only philosophers do not see that what they say is completely stupid. So, what I would like to do is to think about the form of negativity in the context of the opposition. I mean, I won't repeat all the things that we have been repeating till now, opposition between finite and the infinite. You know the definition of what is finite, terminari, potest, etc., and that Spinoza also re-established in proposition 1.8 in the opposition between partial negation and absolute affirmation. So that's a context. In that context, I will drop my thought experiment. So let's start with, very briefly, a bit boringly, with the reconfiguration of what Spinoza means by absolute affirmation. So the opposition between partial negation and absolute affirmation is the same, I think, but finally, we don't know if it's indeed the same, is the same, I think, with that between modifications of substance and substance as such. However, Spinoza argues, we tend to confuse both modification and the substance. We start from the experience made of finite things, modes and modifications of the substance, and attribute them to the nature of substance. Hence, for example, the idea that substance would have a beginning and an end, like singular things. For to have a beginning and an end, in short, a duration, as you know, belongs only to things said to be finite. So we must therefore reverse the order of thought, which starts with the effects, and try to understand how knowledge of the effect depends on knowledge of the cause. Good. Only such thinking will be able to dismantle and overthrow or destroy the fabrica of our inveterate prejudices, totam illam fabricam destruere. This fabrica has accustomed us to thinking in a finalistic or teleological terms, which, in fact, as a form of thinking, upsets the order of nature. What in reality is a cause is conceived as an effect and vice versa. Hence the necessity and the task, for example, of understanding that the representation we have of a final cause is nothing more than the expression of human appetite, for example. And as you know, an appetite is, of course, the form taken by the conatus when related simultaneously to soul and body, 3-9 scholium. Yeah? This effort, as we know, is the actual essence of a thing. And an essence, in a singular thing, persevering in its being, only expresses in a precise and determined way the nature or essence of God, that is, his power. Good. In God, we know essence and existence are one and the same. As a substance, he is in se and conceives himself per se. He is the cause of himself, causa sui. At the contrary, the finite thing is in alio, exposed to that which itself it is not. Its essence does not imply existence. The cause of its existence comes from God. Thus, the effort made by a thing to persevere in its being, i.e., its proper and singular nature or power, is the precise and determined expression of God's power. That by which he acts, and acts in the strongest sense of the term, being an adequate cause. Through this singular effort, the entire nature asserts, affirms itself, or conversely, this effort is a modification of the substance that acts or affirms itself absolutely. We can therefore understand why nothing essential or natural in a singular thing can contain anything that could destroy it. It has been discussed many times now during the conference. By modification of substance is meant, an affection. Particular things are affections, in other words, modes of the attributes of God by which the attributes of God are expressed. Expression and affection coincide. From the point of view of the substance, they actualize the absolute way of self-affirmation. From the point of view of the modes, affection is reduced to partial negation. So that's your position. The realm of the finite is, as we have said, that in which things are limited by others. Quae, alia, ejusdem, naturae, terminari, potest. Taking into consideration the conatus of a finite thing, this limitation can be described as Spinoza sets out in the axiom of part 4, to which has been referred this morning. There he asserts that there are no singular thing in nature, such that there is not another, stronger and more powerful. For once anything is given, there is another more powerful thing that will destroy the first one. In view of this power to act, which determines finite things, I would tend to use the verb terminare with the ambiguity it contains, and which is also inherent to some verbs. For example, in French we say achever, or even in Dutch, beautifully, we say afmaken, which means both to accomplish, to achieve, but also to destroy, to kill, to terminate. What is a finite thing? It's a thing that destroys less powerful things in order to fulfill its own nature, until the day when it is itself destroyed by a power stronger than itself. And of course, from the point of view of the substance, these are merely infinite endings in the linguistic meaning, as used in French, the terminaison, of one and the same absolute affirmation. If finite things affect each other, it is, as we have said, in the sense that they are merely modes which, by virtue of the fourth definition of E1, are affections of substance, substantia affectionis. And since this substance is absolute affirmation, its modes are ultimately no more than expressions of what we might call self-affection. Substance as such, by definition, being infinite in its essence, implying existence, cannot destroy itself. Okay. The potentiality of non-existence, Spinoza points out in the third demonstration of 11, part 1, is impotence, whereas to be able to exist is power. Posse non existere impotentia est, et contra posse existere potentia est. We could say of the substance what Bergson said of duration, which is a substance in itself: there is no void, it's pure fullness. Good. Second part, absolute negation. It is therefore, because of our prejudices, the fruit of a confusion of thought starting from effects, with that fixing causes, that we attribute by fiction a beginning or an end to substances. Okay. In his appendix of part 1, Herman has referred to that also this morning, Spinoza praises mathematical thinking for its, I would call, redeeming, rescuing, therapeutic, liberating virtue. For this kind of thinking is not concerned with ends, but only with the essences and properties of figures. Okay. It is through this form of thinking, which shows man another standard of truth, that this imaginary order, conducive to prejudices and superstition, can be overthrown, evertere. Okay. And here starts my thought experiment of La Fable. But it is also mathematical thinking that has turned nature upside down, naturam omnino evertere. Not by inverting the order of cause and effects, but by reversing the relationship between the partial and the absolute. It is this inversion I would like to talk about. Spinoza was confident when he claimed that a desire born out of reason can have no excess. 461. In the 20th century, a number of events have shattered a little bit this confidence. This is well known. The excess I'd like to think about is the one that triggered a very specific series of events, namely the invention, the development, the use, the deterrence of the atomic bomb. In an article published in the Philosophical Magazine, October 1912, Ernst Rutherford used the term nucleus for the first time. As Bernard Fernandez says, this was the baptismal act of this strange object, so incredibly small, with which gathers all the positive charge of the atom, almost its mass. Based on his experiments, he also stipulated, with regard to the gold atom, that the nucleus of this atom must be 10,000 times smaller than the diameter of the atom as a whole. Now, proportionally, comparing the nucleus with the atom, this is a little bit like comparing the situation of une boule de pétanque ball, in a city like Marseille. Only between la boule de pétanque and the city, there is space, itself filled with matter, houses, streets, cars, rats, what you want. Yeah? Whereas between the nucleus and the rest of the atom, so Rutherford says, there is nothing. You know? The atom, he says, is for a great part 99.9999% empty. You know? From a metaphysical point of view, this idea, for me at least, is shattering. There is emptiness within what for Descartes was infinitely divisible. You know? And whereas for Newton, matter fluttered around in empty space, Rutherford locates the void, the emptiness, in matter's most intimate core and structure, you know? In the atom. The emptiness is no longer opposed to matter, it encompasses or envelopes the nuclei of its physical basis. I think, maybe I'm wrong, that a whole body of mathematical thought has invested this emptiness, this void. Its models and conceptualizations have fixed themselves on it, you know, releasing a power radically contrary to that posited by an essence. You know. No longer the power to persevere in one's existence or being, but that of destroying and reducing to nothingness. You know. I think of no better description of the physical thought behind the atomic bomb than Cioran's acerbic and trenchant description. I quote, "Thought," he says, "in its essence is destruction. More precisely, in its principle. Yeah? We begin to think in order to break ties, yeah? To dissolve affinities, to compromise the framework of reality. Yeah? With the use of the bomb, or with the execution of the Trinity test in Alamogordo, a new idea emerged, that everything that perseveres in its being is potentially threatened by mass destruction, as if the very idea of nuclear power were like a virus dissolving the conatus from within. You probably know that very moment when Oppenheimer had to admit that there was at least still a very small chance that the bomb tested in Los Alamos could ignite the Earth's entire atmosphere. Well, it never inhibited any of these brilliant minds working on the Manhattan Project to go further and to undertake the Trinity test, neither to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The inner drive of the mind is in itself indifferent to the consequences the creation and its creation could effectuate. The mathematician von Neumann, who calculated the right heat, l'auteur, to make Hiroshima's bomb more effective, even claimed the following. What we are creating now is a monster whose influence is going to change history. If there is any history left, but it would be impossible not to continue with it, not only for military reasons, it would also be unethical, he says, from scientific point of view, not to do what we know is feasible, regardless of what hideous consequences it would have. The discovery of nuclear power and its destructive potentiality is a result of mind's own negative power, meaning not to do what is feasible means here and becomes to do and accomplish something that is unthinkable, unfeasible from the point of view of nature. Because that what is called feasible here, and from a point of view of physical science, is based on the discovery of something that does not belong to being, I would say. Eugen Wigner says, we are discovering something that even God had not created for us. The mind no longer expresses through the attribute of thought in a determined and precise way being. Being as such is no longer a tribute to it. You probably remember the passage of 418, where Spinoza claims that suicides are weak-minded, and those committing suicide are overcome by external causes repugnant to their nature. But here, with the relentless research and development of nuclear physics, thought in its most precise and adequate accomplishments, hence not submitted to external forces, is as such suicidal, as being completely indifferent to any form of exteriority. Thinking, although precise and determinate, is turning itself against being and the existences it implies, producing ideas that allow human creatures to annihilate life and matter. As we all know, for Spinoza, to think is to conceive. The concept is the form an idea takes to express in a well-defined way the essence of God. That means the substantial being in which being in itself and per se concipitur coincide. Conceiving essences is a way of positing things. But in the case of nuclear physics, what is at stake is above all beyond the discovery and manifestation of the internal structure of matter that they discover, namely what I would call the essence of matter. Beyond that, and all that is at stake beyond that, is the way to destabilize the equilibrium between motion and rest constitutive of the individuation of bodies. The essence of a thing, as we know, is the power to act and to persevere in its existence, a power, once more, it derives from God, since, by definition, the essence of a finite thing does not imply existence. Good. This power to act is, once again, the expression of the absolute power of the substance, divine being, being both the efficient cause and of the efficient cause of the existence and of the essence of things. Now, and this power to act maintains the thing in its individuality, res singularis. Now, with nuclear fission, a power, an energy is released that is no longer the expression of an essence, but of its disintegration. In defining a singular thing, to definition 7, Spinoza also stipulates how the concurrence of several individuals in the production of a single effect enables us to consider them all as a singular thing. An essence, a power to act. But what to say of a single cause, like the splitting of the atom, that produces a series of indefinite, uncontrollable effects, uncontrollable because of their devastating nature? I find it rather difficult to locate and introduce this purely negative power into the ontology of the ethics. Let's take up again the basis opposition between the finite and the infinite as arranged in the opening of part 1. The finite, we said, is by definition in alio. The infinite is in se. Good. This opposition overlaps that between operare versus agere. The realm of the operation is that of things constrained and determined by other things to exist, as we know, and that of action is the realm of the so-called free thing, it est, that acts by the sole necessity of its nature. Good. Concerning the operating things, all the effects produced by these operations are something positive, says Spinoza. It is therefore God, once more, who is their efficient cause. Now, but what about a bomb that releases its destructive energy in response to nuclear fission? Yeah. Let us compare it with Spinoza's example of the poison, often discussed during this conference. Poison is in itself equipped with a conatus, whose power to act destabilizes and disrupts the power and individuating principles and rhythm of the poisoned body. Good. But at the contrary, there is nothing I see positive about fission. You know? Behind it, there is no determined existence, which would exist and begin to operate in response to other things, which would themselves begin to operate in response to other things et sic in infinitum. Yeah? In the bomb, this infinitum takes on the negative form. Yeah? An efficient cause, the fission of an atomic essence, triggers a series or chain of reactions that causes the things within which it is propagated to disappear. Where operations, for example poisons, may force singular things to reconfigure themselves as individuals at the cost of their essence eventually, nuclear explosion destroys all positive power of reconfiguration at root. A poison is like a singular thing, a thing that can only operate if it is itself determined to exist and to operate by another, and so on. But the efficient cause of the nuclear bomb itself, it sets itself to operate without being determined by another, and ultimately without being determined by God. What remains of its devastating operation is itself no longer determined either to operate nor to exist. Matter is dead. I'll come back to this. On a metaphysical level, we could also suggest how this idea of fission spreads to the very heart of substance. What happens is quite simply a split, I think, between conceiving and being. The entire Spinozist system rests on its identity. As you know, proposition 2.7, for example, it is this identity that establishes the identity of the order and connection linking ideas to things. So underneath the connections we find, as he says, one and the same connection of causes. True, but nuclear fission is based on a connection of ideas that overthrow, disrupts and destroys the connection of things, of matter itself in its most intimate structure. Matter and thought split. For Spinoza, everything that is in God, and nothing without God can be or can be conceived. And human thought is God's thought insofar as it is explained by the nature of the human soul, we know. But with the development of nuclear energy, a form of thought has been freed itself from this substantial determination, I would say, in order to develop a force that no longer expresses being, but pure and simple annihilation. The form of thought creates a force that no longer occurs solely by virtue of the law of God's infinite nature. It sets itself up outside God. We know that for Spinoza, one substance cannot be affected by another substance outside itself. And all affection boils down to the expression of modes, themselves an expression of being. Thus, Spinoza can say, there can be no substance outside God whose action this divine nature passively undergoes. We would have no reason to say that God is passive before anything else. But with the atomic bomb affecting matter in its very essence, dismembering its essential singular structure, a force has been unleashed, that renders substance, I would say, passive. By the very fact that it shatters and obstructs the order underlying the relationship between the attributes. The significance of the fears felt during the first test caused by the idea to ignite the entire atmosphere, I think, cannot be underestimated. They merely illustrate the feeling that, from now on, the power of nature to persevere in his being depends on the inhibition or restriction of human beings to develop their own power. Nuclear power has given rise to the idea of a possible world suicide. No need to wait for the apocalypse. Human civilization can fix its own end. Sartre refers to this idea in a very short but very strong text that he published in the very first issue of what would become the eminent review, Les Temps Modernes. As one of the first philosophers, he addresses the impacts of the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima on the course of history. And he says this: mankind is put in possession of its death. After the death of God, the death of man is announced. The possible suicide of the earth taints our undertakings with a subtle nothingness. Conclusion, absurdum est. Let me once more summarize some basic claims. Spinoza's sense of the infinite depends on the infinite. Spinoza's sense of the finite depends on the infinite. A finite thing whose essence does not imply existence depends on a being that exists by the necessity of its nature. Good. The very meaning of the finite depends on a conception of infinite nature, identifying being and perfection. The end is partial negation. Yet, the very idea of the atomic bomb as a paradigm, as a concept, metaphysical concept, I would say, is one whose essence, if I may say so, implies absolute destruction and negation. So the question is there still an essence? Okay. In this sense, its explosion illustrates what Sartre nicely called un événement absolu. In other words, an event which, on metaphysical level, imposes a split, a crisis, a split, a real crisis before and after. In the indefinite duration of things, an efficient cause produces a deflagration that suppresses the thing and does not posit it. And this in an infinite order. The power with which man destroys a singular thing is no longer borrowed from the power of God, of nature. Man's power is infinite by the very fact that it can no longer be explained by its own actual essence, but by the nothingness that is or inhabits his thoughts. A thought which is not part of the infinite power of nature. Man undergoes changes that cannot be understood by his nature alone, assuming he ever at one. We saw that in the appendix of part 1, Spinoza's ethics intends the destruction of the fabrica, or our imaginary construction of what we believe to be the world, totam illam fabricam destruere, now by restituting the true and adequate order of thinking, the one present in mathematics. Now, in the light of what we just said, the idea of destruction acquires some fresh connotations, since this mathematical way of thinking stands also at the origin of the production of the deflagration of the atomic bomb. The value of it is not measured anymore within the framework of the Fabrica and its human-centered worldview. It is itself produced by the correct way of thinking, supposed to destroy its fiction and construction. As such, it represents a paradigm, that of the accomplishment of the inversion Spinoza hoped for. The explosion of the Fabrica and the imaginary idea of nature created for the sake of human being and their history. This explosion represents a metaphysical inversion, a radical one, between man and nature. Man's activity is not part of nature anymore. Man's desires are not the form a conatus takes, and hence they are no expression of the substance any further. Mathematics was used to produce a force that opposes itself to the structure and the order of being as such. A finite mode creates a power that disrupts the inner structure of one of substance's attributes, extension, by applying the logical laws of the other attribute, thinking. The order of thinking brought into movement a chain of reactions and connections that threatens the connections proper to matter. With the explosion of the atomic bomb, the identity proper to substance, in se per se concipitur, has been smashed. Being and thinking fall apart. To conceive means to dislocate, to fissure, to break open, to disconnect. Now, what remains of the idea of a conatus in such a perspective? Is there anything left that makes an effort to persevere in his being? Well, yes, there is some. Nuclear waste, whose lethal radiation is characterized by a tendency and a power to contaminate all matter, reducing it for 100,000 years to res extensa in its purest form. That matter. Not the indefinite continuation of existence, but the indefinite continuation of a form of death. Not the indefinite continuation of existence, but of a form of death, of that matter, inanimate matter, the residue of the dislocation of order and connection determining attributes and their modes. What is that matter? Spinoza makes clear in the Scholium 213, just before the Petite Physique, that which posits the body as the object of the idea constituting the human soul. He says there how of anything is necessarily given an idea in God, of which God is the cause. Good. Thus, everything of which God has an idea, it means everything, like the human body, has a soul. To varying degrees, of course. But because of the dislocation perpetrated by the unleashing of a nuclear catastrophe, where ideas are designed not to posit a thing, but to destroy it in its essential structure, where the order and connection of ideas undoes and shatters the order and connection of things, of what remains of things, of matter, well, of all this, of that matter, we no longer have an idea. This soulless, lifeless matter, a residue charged with immense lethal radioactive power, the result of a singular, a finite thing that does not operate but destroy by the mere necessity of its nature, at least of its thinking. All this seems quite absurd, doesn't it? Atque hoc absurdum est. That's, I think, what Spinoza would have said in the third demonstration, seeking to prove a posteriori that God necessarily exists. I quote, and I finish with the quotation. Therefore, if what now necessarily exists is reduced to finite things, finite beings, then finite beings have more power than an absolute infinite being. And this is an absurdity. Ut per se notum. Thank you.